Hello, I'm Gabrielle Weiniger. This is the Debka File, exclusive news and insight from the Middle East only on ILTV. Coming up on this week's show, Israel turns to Russia to guarantee the security of its northern border with Syria, and failing that, says it will send in its troops. The US Army revives its joint military exercise with Egypt for the first time since 2011. And Jordan and Iraq push forward to reopen the highway from Baghdad to Amman. But first, 3 deadly attacks in Europe last weekend, 2 in Spain and 1 in Finland, left 16 people dead. Those attacks claimed by the Moroccan wing of the ISIS elite Al-Hasha Brigade, set up for fighters who hold European passports, intended to strike across the continent. Their months-long training is said to be so tough that only 50 trainees graduate, out of recruits from across the UK, France, Germany, Spain, Sweden, Norway and Belgium. Our sources can now reveal that in May and June of this year, Spanish and Moroccan intelligence discovered 2 of these large brigade cells scattered among Morocco's Atlantic coastal town of Essaouira, the capital Rabat, and the Spanish enclave of Melilla. Moroccan anti-terror police also found a large stockpile of weapons in the layers of the network on May 22nd. Now, before we bring in this week's special guest to take a closer look at this elite ISIS group, let's hear the latest from the manhunt for a suspect on the run after the Barcelona van attack that killed 13 people. Spanish police say they can't rule out that he slipped over the border into France. Here's that statement.
Nosotros facilitamos a los cuerpos policiales del Estado que tienen las labores de control de las fronteras, concretamente la Guardia Civil, pero lo hicimos también con Policía Nacional, las identidades de las personas, con lo cual se han hecho los filtros necesarios. Eso no, evidentemente, no excluye la posibilidad de que una persona, con el uso de un vehículo, no le digo que tengamos información en ese sentido, pero como posibilidad, evidentemente, que hayan podido saltar alguna frontera por algunos otros medios. No tenemos información en ese sentido. Habían planificado uno o más de un atentado en la ciudad de Barcelona con el uso de explosivos que probablemente se hubiesen hecho en estas mismas fechas, en ese mismo día o algún día después, y con la voluntad de hacer, evidentemente, bastante más daño el ya mucho que hicieron.
Okay, let's bring in our guest for today, our very own Girish, CEO and Chief Editor of Debka File, standing by via Skype from Jerusalem. Girish, thanks for being with us. How many times are we going to hear news like this from London, Manchester, Paris, Barcelona, and start to think that this is part and parcel of perhaps living in a big city?
Well, that is possible, but the point is that in the next few weeks we're going to hear more and more about it, because it's the end of the tourist season in Europe. It's the beginning of the musical festivals, and there's no doubt that ISIS or local cells or people or cells that coming from the outside are going to act again. Spain was only the beginning.
Well, actually, that's the point. Barcelona and Spain, they weren't on terror alert when the van ploughed into Las Ramblas. But we do now know the CIA had alerted Madrid to an attack afoot in the city. How can this be prevented in the future?
That's very difficult. I mean, the only way in places like Las Ramblas is to block the traffic there and to turn it to be only a pedestrian area. But otherwise, it's very difficult to prevent such a thing. Of course, the most important thing, if you have in the previous or you got knowledge ahead about what's going to happen, that's a different case. But even in the case of Barcelona, if the Spanish were warned, they have done nothing to prevent it or even to try to block such an accident.
Let's bring it back to the region that we're in now. How relevant is the pushback against ISIS in Syria related to the attacks in Europe?
It's very, I know that people have the tendency to, to connect the two and say that ISIS is being beaten in Syria is trying to show sort of that he's still in force and he still is capable of hitting in Europe. But I don't believe that's the case. That's not the case. There is hardly any connection between what's going on in the field in Syria and what's going on in Europe or in other places around the world.
So what else do we know about this particular ISIS group, this elite group, the Amniyat al-Kharji Brigade? They were set up in Europe, but presumably they are still in contact with Syria.
Oh, sure. They have a daily contact with Syria. They have a daily contact in Syria because in Syria, the commanders are sort of following very carefully what they are doing and giving them daily instructions and consulting with them and telling them what next to do. That has nothing to do with if the ISIS forces in Deir ez-Zor or Raqqa being beaten or under a fierce attack.
I want to get a picture of what this group looks like. What does their training involve? How many people are there? How are they recruited?
Well, it's a very similarity if you will look at what the elite forces in every modern army today is going through every recruits to such units. And the only difference between the training here, it's the ideological sort of brainwashing them and preparing people to sacrifice themselves and to explode themselves and to die. That's the cost of life for them. That comes with the job.
Well, we know they were exposed by British media this week. What kind of action is the Western intelligence community taking against them?
Well, it all depends. It all depends on how vigorous the intelligence agencies are, how vital they are, how ready they are to connect the dots between the different pieces of puzzles of information that they are getting. And they should be alert of 24 hours around the clock. And that's unfortunately not the case everywhere.
All right, we'll keep an eye on that. Stay with us, Giora, as we move along. Israel is becoming increasingly concerned over its northern front after a delegation sent to Washington last week returned empty-handed. Headed by Mossad chief Yossi Cohen, Israel was looking to reverse the G20 Hamburg deal between Russia and the United States made last month, which plants de-escalation zones on Syria's southern borders. Supervision of the ceasefire is in the hands of the Russian military police, of course, Moscow being the main backer of President Bashar al-Assad. Israel asked the US for a guarantee against Assad's other allies, namely Iranian-backed militia. But finding the White House preoccupied with the events in Charlottesville, Debka File can now reveal that Israel has turned to Russia for help. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu making an urgent date with President Putin at the Black Sea resort of Sochi to warn that Israel may send its troops into Syria. Our military sources here at Debka rate this move as an extremely high-risk maneuver that could spark clashes between the Israeli army and Hezbollah, possibly with spillover into Lebanon. More on this with our editor-in-chief, Girish Sham. Giora, how likely is this scenario that Israel will send its own troops across the border to push its enemies back after 6 years of almost non-intervention?
Well, that's a very good question. It all depends what kind of answers, if at all, Mr. Netanyahu going to hear from Mr. Putin. But I must say that there is another possibility, that before he is leaving, there can be even some kind of limited military clash between Hezbollah forces and Israeli forces. And each of them will try to prove that they got the upper hand or they got the advantage.
What makes you think there might be a clash between Hezbollah and Israel?
Excuse me?
What makes you think that clash could happen?
Well, because Hezbollah is very well, Hezbollah and Tehran, the Iranian, are very well what's going to happen in the Putin-Netanyahu meeting, and they know exactly what Netanyahu, how much pressure is going to put on Putin to agree to Israeli demands, and it's very difficult to believe that they will sit quiet and to wait for the outcome of the conversation. It's more possible that they will try to act before it.
What do you think Putin's response will be to Netanyahu when he requests for a guarantee of security on his northern border on the Golan Heights?
I think he's going to be very polite, and he is not going to give any commitments whatsoever to Netanyahu. Certainly not what Netanyahu going to ask him or demand from him. He's in a very delicate position now, a very powerful but very delicate position now in Syria, and he's not going to shake his understanding with American President Trump.
But I mean, Israeli entry into Syria, it would be a huge deal. How would people respond to this? How would the community respond, the international community, the Middle East? What can we expect to see from that? And what would trigger such a thing?
Well, it all depends. It's all the trigger about it. The question is, who will dictate what happened along the borders of Israel and Jordan and Syria? And as we are talking, the U.S. Defense Minister, Jim Mattis, is now in Amman. So let's see and wait what's going to be the outcome of these conversations there.
I just want to bring it back now to the Israeli delegation that went to Washington to ask for a guarantee for their border. America seems preoccupied. Are they still invested in the Syrian civil war?
The answer is no, certainly not. Trump withdrawing from Syria, Trump is withdrawing from any involvement in the Syrian crisis. The only American role now in Syria is a very limited war against ISIS, and that's too waning.
All right, let's delve a little deeper into these so-called de-escalation zones and the deal broker between the US and Russia. The zones include Daraa and Quneitra in southwestern Syria. This week, Syrian government forces claimed they have captured a large part of the southern province of Sueda from the hands of the opposition, cutting off a number of weapons smuggling routes across the border with Jordan used over the past 6 years of civil war. Now, the UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights accuses the Syrian army of violating the ceasefire in its campaign to retake the de-escalation zones. But a commander of the government forces has fired back, saying extremist groups breached the agreement first. Take a listen to that.
بالوقت اللي اعلنوا انه منطقه هذه بيشملها وقف اطلاق النار ما التزموا بهالامور هذه. كانت تظلوا الامدادات تجيهم من اليمين واليسار، من كل جهه تجي الامداد، المسلحين يفوتوا على راحتهم، المسلحين ويضربونا، نحن صار لنا هلا صراع مرير، نحن لحتى يوم النصر بالضبط للامس صراع مرير نحن وياهم، قتال عنيف لحتى نقدر انه ما يخلون يدخلوا.
Let's cross back to Jerusalem, where our own Debka File CEO and editor-in-chief Giora is with us via Skype. We just heard an exchange of accusations there. Did the recapture of Sueda by the Syrian army go against the US-Russia brokered deal?
Well, I mean, look, it's always the same story in Syria. The Russians are breaking a deal with the United States. They are keeping their promises, but unfortunately not the Iranian, not the Syrians, not the Hezbollah are obliged to these commitments, and they are actually acting under the umbrella of the Russians. So we have here sort of a situation layer on layer on layer, and it all depends on what's happening in the area. At the end of the day, the Syrians are getting in charge, or more actually back on their borders. And if the Syrians are in charge of their borders, the Iranian too, and Hezbollah too.
So how much has the Syrian army and its allies gained over these checkpoints and border posts? And how much is still in the hands of rebel groups?
Well, it all depends. It's as well the rebels now, let's put it this way. There are hardly any rebels groups that are fighting except of the radicals. I mean ISIS or Jabhat al-Nusra Front. The rest of the rebels, even if they are being equipped and being paid and getting weapons and ammunition from Israel, from the United States, from Jordan, they are actually now under huge pressure. Some of them are actually stopped to fight. They're putting their weapon aside at the best. In the worst, they're crossing lines and bringing the weapon back to the Syrian army.
All right, these de-escalation zones could be a test of coordination between the world powers over a future settlement in Syria. Thanks for your analysis on this, and stay with us as we move along. Now we're staying with Syria, and Debka File can now reveal that President Bashar al-Assad's two main allies have fallen out. Tehran is accusing Moscow of two-timing on the alliance with Syria in deals with the Americans. Let's go straight back to Jerusalem with our editor-in-chief, Girish, to break this down for us. Gura, why does Iran feel left out in the cold?
Iran is feeling that the Russians are trying to pull the carpet under their feet. They are everywhere that the Russian or the Iranian coming in. The end of the day, the Russians are sending their officers, and they are the ones that are in charge of what's going on around in the area. That is the case in Aleppo, that's the case in Hama, and even this week it is the case in Damascus. And the Iranians are worried that their influence in Syria will be diminished as in the time that the Russians are getting more and more control.
So how will this wedge between Russia and Iran affect the future of Syria?
That's a very difficult question to answer. That's a lot depends on Assad, and a lot depends, and therefore, as we had yesterday, he praised Khamenei, he praised Putin, and he praised Nasrallah, and actually he told them, look, you can decide between yourself what's going on in Syria, but you must take in consideration me. At the end of the day, I'm the one that will say what's going to happen here. And that's a very delicate game that all the three participants are playing together. Unfortunately for the United States and Israel, all four of them are playing it between themselves without many considerations to the outside forces or the forces around it.
All right, Girish, CEO of Debka File. Now to the latest in Iraq and the battle there against ISIS. That fight now focused on Tal Afar, located 55 kilometers west of the second city of Mosul and a key strategic location for northern Iraqi-Syria border crossings. Officially announced last Sunday by Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi, on paper the offensive involves the Iraqi army, Kurdish Peshmerga forces and Iraq's popular mobilization units. But Iranian General Qasem Soleimani of the Revolutionary Guards is the overall commander. He's the #1 of the Hezbollah Syrian army's ongoing offensive against extremists in the Kalamon mountain range. That range straddles the Syrian-Lebanese frontier. He's also heading a third front, the offensive in the eastern Syrian desert province of Deir ez-Zor, where many ISIS fighters have relocated parts of their former Raqqa command. Moving on, and the US military has resurrected its biennial joint military exercise with Egypt called Bright Star 2017, marking the first time the United States has participated in the joint exercise since the toppling of Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak in 2011. Then President Barack Obama decided to cancel the exercise in 2014 over allegations of human rights abuses by the Egyptian government following the 2013 military coup. Sudan, which severed ties with Iran last year, will be co-opted for the first time, coinciding with a visit to Egypt by Sudan's Chief of Staff, General Ahmad Adin Adawi. Let's bring back for the final time today Girish, our editor and CEO here at Debka File to break it down with America's apparent change of heart. Why the change of policy by the Trump administration to re-establish this military exercise, and how symbolic is it?
Well, it's highly symbolic because it's for many years now, actually, the U.S. administration ignored, more or less tried to ignore Egyptian President Fattah al-Sisi, but unfortunately for them, is having more and more important role in defending Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. And that's mainly because the Red Sea is now considered to be even more strategically, military strategically important than the Gulf itself.
All right, Girish, Sham, CEO and Editor-in-Chief of Debka File, thank you for your analysis today. And finally, thank you. A naval base in the Horn of Africa is this year's hottest prize in the power rivalry stakes. The most aggressive bidders in recent months are China, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. They are setting up naval footholds for control of the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, that you can see on your screen, and the southern approaches of the Indian Ocean. 5 naval bases already dot those coastlines, which stretch 3,000 kilometers from Somali Bosaso to Port Sudan. Riyadh recently reached a deal with Sudan's Omar Bashir for the use of Sudan's facilities. Between those 2 points, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have also acquired the use of 3 other ports, Eritrea's Assab, Djibouti and Somali Berbera, which lies on the international oil route. China and Saudi Arabia are also building bases at Djibouti, next door to the big US AFRICOM base. For now, though, let's bring you the news in brief. Jordan and Iraq are pushing forward to reopen the highway from Baghdad to Amman, cutting through the western Iraqi desert, a route which was once an important channel for commerce, accounting for around $1 billion in trade per month. 1 million African refugees are backed up in Libya, waiting to be smuggled across the Mediterranean to Europe. It's the main gateway for people attempting the perilous journey to reach Europe by sea, with more than 15,000 people crossing each of the past 3 years. Russia and Syria have integrated their air defenses, essentially placing both under Russian command and raising alarm bells for both America and Israel. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad reopened the Damascus International Fair for the first time in 5 years, but a short while after he gave his victory speech, a rebel shell hit the event, killing 6 people and wounding several others. The United Arab Emirates is set to give $15 million a month to the Gaza Strip. This as its rulers Hamas move ever closer to the UAE-based rival to Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. Debka says Hamas is looking to provide Abbas's arch-rival Mohammed Dahlan with a power base. That wraps up this week's show. Just a sample of the Debka Weekly newsletter you can get straight to your inbox. For the full range of exclusive news and insights, you can sign on at www.debka.com/weekly. Thanks for joining us here at Debka File from the ILTV studios in Tel Aviv. See you again next week.